Religious institutions have held a unique position in society for centuries. They've claimed to be the moral compass of humanity, the gatekeepers of ethics, and the protectors of the vulnerable. People are taught to trust them blindly. To question them is often labeled as blasphemous or sinful. This has allowed religious institutions to shield themselves from criticism, legal scrutiny, and public accountability. But behind the sermons and sacred texts, there's a dark undercurrent that's been systematically ignored, silenced, or swept under the rug: sexual misconduct. Sexual abuse in religious settings isn't new. What's striking isn't just the occurrence, but the frequency, the scale, and the protection these institutions have extended to the perpetrators. From the Catholic Church to Islamic madrasas, stories of sexual abuse, often targeting children, have surfaced repeatedly. And in most of these cases, the offenders weren't just any individuals. They were religious leaders, seen as holy figures, as people of God. That's what makes the betrayal even deeper. Let's start with the Catholic Church because the data here is both abundant and damning. In the United States alone, a comprehensive investigation by the John Jay College of Criminal Justice found that between 1950 and 2002, over 4,000 priests were accused of sexually abusing more than 10,000 children. These are just the cases that were reported. Most survivors stay silent, often for decades, due to fear, shame, or psychological trauma. So the real numbers are likely much higher. And this isn't just a problem of the past. Even in recent years, large-scale investigations in countries like Australia, Ireland, France, Germany, and Chile have revealed that abuse within the church was widespread and systemic. In 2021, a French report estimated that over 330,000 children were sexually abused by clergy or church-related personnel since 1950. The figure is so large that it's hard to even process emotionally. That's the population of an entire city, shattered. One common defense is that abuse happens everywhere, in schools, homes, sports clubs. And yes, abuse is a global issue, but what makes religious institutions different is how they respond to it. Instead of reporting abuse to the authorities, many churches relocated offending priests to other parishes, giving them fresh access to more children. There was no serious punishment, just a transfer, a fresh start, and often more victims. This wasn't just negligence, it was a deliberate cover-up. And the cover-ups weren't limited to a few rogue bishops. In 2018, a grand jury report in Pennsylvania found that church officials from 6 dioceses had systematically covered up abuse by more than 300 priests over a 70-year period. The victims numbered over 1,000, many of whom were children as young as 7 or 8. The documents recovered showed that these officials weren't trying to stop abuse. They were trying to manage it, like a public relations problem. The psychological damage done to victims is severe. Survivors often suffer from PTSD, depression, anxiety, and addiction. Many struggle with relationships, trust, and intimacy for the rest of their lives. Some take their own lives. The spiritual betrayal adds a layer of confusion and guilt. They were told they were being loved in a holy way, that their suffering was a test, or that speaking out would harm the church and offend God. And while the Catholic Church is often in the headlines, it is far from alone. In the Islamic world, madrasas, religious schools where young boys memorize scripture, have also been places of silent suffering. Reports from Pakistan, Bangladesh, and parts of Africa and the Middle East have revealed alarming cases of child abuse in these settings. In 2020, a BBC investigation into Pakistani madrasas revealed that clerics had raped or sexually abused hundreds of young boys. Most cases were settled quietly. Families were pressured into silence. Victims were shamed or blamed. Justice was rare. Part of the problem is that religious teachers are often placed on a pedestal. Their word is sacred. Questioning them is seen as an attack on religion itself. This gives abusers unchecked power. The children, often from poor families, live in these institutions completely dependent on their teachers for food, shelter, and survival. They are groomed to obey without question. There are no cameras, no oversight, no child protection policies, and in many cases, no laws that are enforced. In some places, parents themselves discourage children from speaking out. Not because they support abuse, but because they fear social backlash. They fear being ostracized. They fear angering the local religious elite. So the silence continues, and the abuse repeats. This isn't just a failure of individuals. It's a failure of systems that claim moral superiority, but are structured in a way that enables abuse. In many religions, celibacy is held as a virtue. But repressing natural desires doesn't make them disappear. It often distorts them. Add to that an environment of total obedience, secrecy, and reverence, and you get a breeding ground for exploitation. And it's not only about sexuality, it's about power. Sexual abuse is often less about desire and more about control. In these institutions, leaders hold absolute power. Their word is law. They are believed to be in direct contact with the divine. That kind of authority is dangerous. It creates a psychological imbalance where the victim feels small, voiceless, and helpless. And when abuse occurs, the first instinct is often disbelief. How could a man of God do something so vile? The doubt goes to the victim, not the perpetrator. In some countries, laws are written in a way that protects religious institutions. Churches don't have to report abuse. Priests can refuse to testify, claiming confessional privilege. That means if a child tells a priest they are being abused, or if an abuser confesses, nothing gets reported. The church protects itself, not the child. Even when these cases come to light, institutions often issue apologies instead of real reform. They set up internal review boards, create new guidelines, offer counseling. But the core structure remains untouched. Priests are still held as divine representatives. Religious schools still operate with minimal oversight. There is little external accountability. There's also a financial dimension. Many churches and religious schools are incredibly wealthy. They use their resources to fight lawsuits, discredit victims, and delay justice. In the United States alone, the Catholic Church has paid over $3 billion in settlements. But this hasn't brought closure. It hasn't prevented future abuse. It's just the cost of maintaining an image. One of the most tragic aspects is how religion is used to justify silence. Victims are told to forgive. They're told it's all part of a divine plan. That suffering brings them closer to God. That talking about it would bring shame to the community. In many cases, survivors internalize this guilt. They feel responsible for what happened. They feel dirty, sinful, unworthy. But they're not. They're victims of a system that prioritizes its reputation over their pain. It's also worth asking, how many great spiritual leaders, prophets, or saints would have spoken out against this? How many would have exposed the corruption in their own institutions? The uncomfortable truth is, if these abuses had been happening in a secular organization, say, a school or a corporation, public outrage would be overwhelming. Heads would roll. Governments would intervene. But when it's a church or a madrasa, the reaction is muted. Reverence protects rot. Why is it that the more holy a person is believed to be, the less likely people are to question their behavior? This isn't about attacking religion for the sake of it. This is about looking at power, silence, and the human cost of blind faith. Religion claims to be the highest moral authority. That's why its failures must be held to the highest standard. And right now, it's falling short. Very short. It's not enough to say, not all religious leaders are abusers. Of course they're not, but that's not the point. The point is that the structures themselves allow abuse to happen and continue. The systems don't protect the vulnerable. They protect the institution. Some argue that reform is the answer, that we need better rules, more oversight, better training. But the real question is, why are these institutions treated as beyond question in the first place? Why are we still giving moral authority to organizations that have repeatedly betrayed the trust of millions? When any human institution wields this much power without scrutiny, abuse is inevitable, whether it's religious or not. But the difference with religion is that it hides behind sacredness. It weaponizes morality. It uses the fear of hell or divine punishment to keep people silent. The damage done to children in the name of God is one of the great moral failings of our time. And it continues, not because we don't know about it, but because too many people are afraid to confront it. There is no healing without truth, no justice without accountability, and no progress without the courage to question what we're told is sacred. And sometimes the most dangerous place for a child is not a dark alley or a war zone. It's a place with stained glass windows and verses carved in stone. Because that's where the devil wears robes, and no one thinks to look. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.